Hey everyone, welcome to another Screenwriting Tips. My name is Tony D. Today we're going to talk about disaster movies. What do we mean by a disaster movie? Well, you've got your weather disaster movies like Tornado, 2012 with John Cusack, earthquake movies, the volcano movies, those kinds of movies like natural events. You also have man-made events, and one could argue that 2012 and some of the weather-related ones are man-made. But things like the classic, the movie that kind of started it all was The Towering Inferno, and you had a lot of movies like that in the early '70s, like airplane disaster movies. They're sort of a disaster film. You still have ones. Monster movies kind of fall into that trope. They're very similar. And you also have the movies about infectious diseases. Those are kind of in that realm. And even zombie movies kind of overlap. So the main thing you need in a disaster movie is a realistic disaster that people can be actually afraid of. A lot of it depends upon the era. The Towering Inferno was made in an era that skyscrapers were still relatively new. The technology that built them and the technology to fight fires was still kind of new. And also the airplane type movies, not Airplane the movie, but the airport movies that came out around the similar time. At that time, there were people hijacking planes, and that was the main fear, hijacking a lot of times, and there were some plane crashes too. But the main fear was it was in the news. So really, these movies, they're kind of fear-based. I think some of the more recent ones, like 2012 and the volcano movie and those like that, there was that one, the one with the weather machine. There was a couple other ones with like meteors hitting the Earth or the Earth completely changing, its climate and stuff like that. So that was in vogue for a short time because climate change was in vogue. There's probably some of that generated because of Al Gore's movie, and so really you've got to do a disaster movie, you've got to hit it just at the right time. You've got to be topical. You got to sort of ride the wave of fear, whatever it is at the time, while at the same time you can't cross the line where like Hollywood won't touch it. So there's not a lot of, or there wasn't a lot of call for movies that would ape 9/11, let's say, because that was like too close of a subject. That was like too close to home. There had been in the past plenty of terrorist movies, which were sort of like a disaster movie, but there's really not a stomach for a 9/11 movie. Partly because, if you look at a movie that was like that, like Munich was made. Because I think that Munich had, how should I word this? It was far enough in the past, and that people can kind of process it, and it wasn't as close to home as say 9/11 was. 9/11, you're not going to see a real quote unquote movie that delves in to the things about September 11th for, I don't know, probably like 20 years. It would be great to see one that really examined, the buildup and the causes of it. Unfortunately, there's just, I think probably the wound is still raw today. There's still wars being fought because of September 11th. So maybe another 10 years down the road you could. But you have to pick a disaster that makes sense. So, right now, probably a disaster that would kind of make sense still and would be sort of on the minds of the audience would be a global warming scenario in which everything floods. You know, that one is pretty believable in today's modern audiences, and you know, they could deal with that if you could create, you know, a crisis event that would you know, would have some characters trying to get away from the flood or whatever. That's the real challenge too. The challenge is the structure of the movie, where, like, you know, how are we going to get away from the thing, whatever it is. In Twister, you had storm chasers, so they had every reason in the world to be near the tornadoes. You know, in the volcano movie, you know, it was about people trying to save themselves and save their town and whatnot. And a lot of times with volcanoes and earthquakes and stuff, people kind of have nowhere to go, or it's too quick. Cloverfield was another example of a movie like that, where people are sort of trapped. It happens very suddenly, and it's about people kind of trying to get to safety. The Poseidon Adventure, that was a classic. That's another 70s movie where the boat flips over and the people are trying to escape, and one by one they die. So let's go over the elements of a disaster movie. Well, obviously you have the disaster. It tends to be a drama. It's definitely not going to be a comedy, although I suppose you have Airplane, which was a parody of those kinds of movies. But you know, it's going to be a serious movie. It's going to have a cast of characters, and a bunch of them will probably die. But ultimately, it'll be about the ones that live and you know, survive this terrible ordeal and learn something from it. A lot of times, you have characters that, you know, need to overcome something, because that's what happens in the movie, right? You have a character that maybe is afraid, or lost his will, or lost his mojo, and you know, by overcoming the disaster, because the character deep down really is a good, capable person, they're sort of reinvigorated by the obstacle, as opposed to if the disaster never happened, this person probably would just plod on with their life, kind of in a slow downward spiral. So you basically start disaster movies all the same way. They usually start the opposite of comedies, where comedies start, or you want to start comedies relatively serious and then heighten the comedy. Disaster movies tend to start light and then get darker as they continue. And there's a balance there. You don't want to go too dark. I mean, you don't want to, like, you know, you're going to be killing off characters. So there's a sort of a movie trick to justify the death of characters so people don't feel too bad for them. And you probably know, just from watching enough movies, the basic elements of that. The first is people die that you don't really get to know, right? So these would be characters that you didn't know their names, maybe they didn't even have any dialogue, so they're no names, and they just die because a lot of people are going to have to die in the movie anyway to make the seriousness of the disaster. So it's fine to introduce a bunch of sort of extras that are all going to die, because the audience won't feel much if they die, because, you know, they're fake people, you know, from the audience's perspective. But since they haven't gotten to know them, they don't even know their names, them dying isn't going to, like, you know, crush their spirit. Whereas if you were to introduce, say, I don't know, a busload of orphans, and they went off a bridge and all died, you'd be like, oh my God, that was terrible. So you don't want to bum out people too much, but at the same time, the people who die in the first act, which usually right at the end of the first act, you want to give a sense that, oh, this is a serious thing. And you don't want them to die in funny ways, which sometimes happened with the classic disasters movies. You know, one of the moments in the Poseidon Adventure is when the boat flips over. Some of the people like cling to these tables that were anchored to the floor, and then they end up falling off and then crashing down into the ceiling windows and dying spectacularly. And it wasn't really meant to be funny, but when you watch the scene, you know, it comes off as a bit much, so it can evoke a little bit of laughter, even if it's nervous laughter, and you kind of don't want that in a disaster movie. You want, you know, and it's a tough call, because on the one hand, in a movie, you want some spectacular scenes, but on the other hand, you don't want to kill people in such a spectacular way that it undermines the seriousness of the situation. But the Poseidon Adventure was sort of a, you know, an exception, so I wouldn't go by that movie per se. So in the first act, you're going to introduce these characters, going to be nice and light, normal, very normal. And then you're going to introduce the disaster, whatever it is. And by the end of the first act, the disaster hits, or at least begins to. Kind of depends upon the disaster. You know, in the Towering Inferno, obviously the fire's going to start and people are going to be trapped. In an airport type movie, obviously the terrorist or whomever are going to take over the plane, or there's a mechanical failure in the plane. In you know, one of these climate change movies, the meteor hits, or you know, the earth tilts and everybody gets frozen in wherever they are. So once you've established that act, the next thing that happens in the second act is you watch the transformation of these characters because of the events that happen to them. So you have this sort of established scene with these characters, and you're establishing who they are normally. And then as Act 2 unfolds, the crisis event almost immediately starts to change them, right? So a lot of times you get, and this happens in zombie movies, a lot of times you get, say, for lack of a better term, blue-collar characters, right? Who, in the normal everyday world, they don't have a lot of power, but in a crisis situation, they know real-world things that could help, right? So a guy who can fix air conditioning units and is good with tools suddenly has a much higher status after the disaster, as opposed to the millionaire hedge fund guy who was just throwing around a lot of money and he doesn't really have any skills. And that's one of the other guys who will probably die, right? Because, you know, rich people, from an audience standpoint, you're not as sympathetic to a guy who's like mega rich. So the easy thing to do is for the screenwriter to make him kind of an asshole, kind of an abrupt guy who's used to throwing his money around. Now he can't. This disaster happened. Maybe his money's not worth anything anymore, and he's still trying to throw his weight around, and then, you know, he gets killed and kind of nobody misses him. Another character that might get killed would be the older guy or the older couple, right? Because older people, well, they've already lived their lives, so they make the ultimate sacrifice for the younger generation. Maybe it's a sort of situation where the future doesn't hold much for them anyway because the world has changed. If you look at a movie like, oh crap, what was that? Oh, The Road. Oh, talk about a depressing movie. They didn't have an older character like that, but Charlize Theron is in it, and she plays, spoilers, she plays the wife, and when the disaster happens, she just like walks out into the cold and kills herself, basically, which is just a weird scene. It's a weird, depressing movie, by the way. I don't know if it's good. It's kind of intense and weird. That scene is the weakest scene in a movie. I mean, I think it's kind of worth seeing. It's definitely worth sort of a Netflix thing. Viggo Vigo. God, I'm thinking of his last name the way they say it, and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. I know that's the wrong way to say it, but you know who I mean, Vigo. Vigo's in it, and he's great. So the second 2/3 of the movie is pretty intense, but it is kind of a downer. If you look at a movie like Children of Men, which I think, from a pure construction standpoint, I think it's a better crafted movie. That to me is like a disaster movie. And the disaster in that movie is there hasn't been new babies born since, I don't know, I think 18 years or 20 years or something. And so it's about saving, finally a baby has been born and they're trying to save the human race. A lot of these movies have very high stakes. So because the stakes are so high, the characters are a little bit more disposable. There's a little more justification. So if you kill yourself trying to save the protagonist, there's a nobility in that, because it's like, well, you got to survive to cure the zombie virus or save humanity or get these kids out of there, or because you're a family man, you got to live, or whatever. But generally in a movie, there's always some justification. There's either justification for certain people to live and certain people to die. Obviously, a lot of times bad people just die. That's the easiest way. You make them bad people, and then the audience will be happy that you kill them. Because again, they're fictional characters. It's not that the audience is full of psychopaths. In fact, I talked about the movie Polar, and Matt Luke is given such an intense performance as the bad guy. I really wanted to see him killed by the end of the movie. So, you don't have to go quite that far in the disaster movie, because there's a little bit of expectation from the audience. Well, people are going to die, especially in the opening scene. Once you kill like 1,000 people and, millions of people that you don't see, millions of people die. The Titanic, of course, is an example. So once you see tons and tons of people die, even good people, you can kind of look at that and say, well, I knew what I was getting into. The way Titanic sort of gets around it, in a way a lot of movies do, is, you can start the movie with the one or two survivors, and then everybody else died, right? So that's a way to do it. It kind of diffuses the death. Certain people are going to die because they're not in the future somewhere. So the challenge then is still making it a surprise. So that's the problem with doing stuff like that. On the one hand, you diffuse the audience's sort of negative reaction to a guy dying, but on the other hand, you end up kind of pulling the punch out of the surprises. And so it needs to be more about how the person died and what was accomplished. That needs to be a bigger surprise. But this is the problem with disaster movies. From my perspective, I don't particularly like them all that much. They're okay. I really like Children of Men. I felt that was a really good one. But more often than not, I don't like them. I like zombie movies, which are kind of disaster movies, but because they have this supernatural element, they tend to be ridiculous and funny in a lot of ways. It's sort of a slightly different genre. I got to do a video about writing a zombie movie because I love writing that. But writing a straight up disaster movie, you're gonna have to do a lot of research. Number one. You're going to have to really think about how a disaster can unfold and how you can craft a narrative around it. Because, a lot of times in a disaster movie, you end up in a situation, well, why would these characters stay in the radius of the earthquake? Or why would these characters not leave the building or leave the ship or leave the area? So that's always an issue with these movies. If you could just run away and get away from it, then, you either end up having to trap the characters in this situation and hoping that justification is enough, or you need, sometimes movie makers just ignore it, and you're just like, well, why don't these people just run? It's definitely a challenge. But anyhow, in the second act, the disaster is probably going to kick up, right? And the protagonist is going to be trying to figure out either how can we cure, beat, or escape the disaster, or survive. It sort of depends upon the disaster. In the case of the disease, obviously they're going to be looking for a cure. You know, and that usually means your main character is going to be a scientist or someone who just happens to be immune to the disease. In a more weather-related natural disaster, it's going to be about possibly the disaster itself, but once the disaster hits, how do you survive the aftermath? Because the aftermath can be pretty crazy. Like in an earthquake movie, the earthquake happens and then it's kind of about surviving the aftermath of the quake. And there's certain things that come with that, right? There are aftershocks that basically, the earthquake happens even more. And there's just all the buildings falling apart and rescuing people. So a lot of times they're trapped in a building. And, you got to, think about that. Those movies have been done. It's a little hard to kind of sell those kinds of movies now. It's not on the forefront of people's minds. Movies involving terrorism, that's a little bit more on the forefront. But again, the whole 9/11 and the whole approach to terrorism in terms of movies, there's so much of that in the news. People are kind of sick of hearing about it. So I think that's kind of why Hollywood gets away from that, because people don't necessarily want to hear about depressing stuff they see in the news. Unless, they did Clint Eastwood just did a movie about the guys who saved people on a train from terrorists. And I haven't seen it, but knowing Clint Eastwood, I guarantee you it's worth seeing, because just about every movie he's ever made is like, especially the movies he's directed. The man knows how to craft a movie. I saw Invictus, a movie about rugby, which I had zero interest in. I have zero interest in sports. And I got to tell you, Invictus is an amazing film. It really is. It's really well done. Flags of Iwo Jima, Gran Torino. The list just, and of course, Unforgiven, one of my favorite movies. So, but if you're looking to do a disaster movie, your research is going to be key. And again, about these characters dying, there's certain characters you can't kill, really. It's really hard for kid characters to be killed and the movie to recover from that. I have a friend, he said since he had a kid, he can't watch, and he's a big horror buff. He cannot watch any movies like that. He just can't do it anymore, because immediately he thinks of his kid. So, like he can't even listen to news stories about bad things that happen to kids. So, you have to understand that people with children do not want to see movies where kids get hurt or killed. That's tough, So people in Hollywood in general they usually just stay the hell away from that. Even just seeing regular people get killed is tough. So that's why, because movies are generally an escape, that's why there's always some sort of, trigger or icing on the cake that like, this guy's gonna die. He's kind of a jerk, or he kind of did the wrong thing. A character that steals, stops to like rob some dead body and then he gets flattened by the earthquake or whatever. You may still feel bad for him, but you don't feel as bad, like, well, he did the wrong thing and the movie killed him, is the sort of feeling. But that, I don't want to discourage you from not killing people in a movie, especially in a drama like a disaster movie. But you just have to be, you have to, deal with it with kid gloves, because too much death can really just send people to the point like, I can't watch that movie. It has to be more, I think, about the disaster than people dying. So if you can structure it in such a way that, yeah, a lot of people die, but we don't really see it, then people can get on board more. They don't have to think about the actual, toll of human misery a disaster might actually take on them. They can just concentrate on the drama. And the danger's there, but it's just not so much in your face that you kind of just, get caught up in that. Because even as you get older, you start to know people who pass away, and that it can be rough on people if they're sitting in a movie and someone dies the way their friend died or a relative died. That can be really tough on people. So you have to keep that in mind. Disaster movies about, events that actually happened, they're more historical dramas in their own way, and, they require a ton of research. And again, you got to really handle it. You got to handle it with kid gloves, because everybody involved is going to have an opinion about it. That's why I think it's often better to fictionalize this kind of stuff, because that way you can shape the narrative in the best way possible. You can, you don't have to worry about people criticizing you over it, and your message can be generally positive, even though the movie may be kind of a downer. Ultimately, these movies tend to be about the human spirit and what it is to survive and overcome a massive disaster, whether it's man-made or nature's wrath or whatever. There's that movie about the tidal wave with Matt Damon. Can't think of the name of it. I mean, that kind of stuff. It's that's another kind of disaster. The tidal wave movie, that was in vogue for a short time. They did a couple of them because tidal waves were hitting. So, there's lots of stuff you can do, but it tends to be a very small window. And they tend to be movies that, if they're not historically based, they're definitely only in vogue for the short time the studios are going to say, okay, this is a thing now. People remember, and people want to see movies where characters overcome this disaster. They don't want to see movies where they relive September 11th per se. You probably could do a drama in which, it's not based on September 11th, but in which hijackers try to take over a plane and, the passengers beat them. That would be, something that people could maybe deal with, because ultimately the passengers win. I don't think they really made any movies like that, but, you could have a movie like that. But generally, the end of a disaster movie, well, people survive. Somebody survives. Usually your protagonist and his friends. Sometimes the protagonist doesn't survive in that movie. Sometimes the protagonist is just there to facilitate the survival, and he makes the ultimate sacrifice at the end. Those movies can be very uplifting despite the death at the end too, because it can kind of be like, wow, that character, he was like the ultimate dude or the ultimate woman. Like, that person sacrificed themselves so the others could live. Wow. That's, it can work. And it can be, it's sad, but you need a big lift if you go that direction. You need a huge lift at the end, like, to really justify the sacrifice, I think. Spoilers, Children of Men didn't quite have that lift. It's kind of a depressing movie, but I liked it because, the sacrifice, even though they don't really show you much after the sacrifice, you kind of get the impression it happened, or at least you want to. I mean, you could leave it kind of open like that, like Children of Men did. It's not really all that open, but it's a little open. That maybe the character did it for nothing, but probably not. So you can leave that up to the audience. The denouement on this stuff is often very short. You know, it's you just want to kind of just say, okay, they survived, and that's it. That's the end of the disaster. Because the moment the disaster's gone and ended, the movie is essentially over. I mean, it's going to peak, and that's it. Yeah, you're dealing with the aftermath, but once the characters are rescued, or once they reach the safe zone, or once they, I don't know, start rebuilding civilization, it's done, you know? So you just got to kind of end it and move on, and try to have the most positive, uplifting moment at the end of the movie. I think you should probably have, depending on how depressing your movie was. And you know, try to send a message that's ultimately positive, that, you know, maybe all these characters died, but they didn't die for naught. So that tends to be the message of a disaster movie. I think the ones that aren't as good, they'll have a message like, you know, that's more sort of self-righteous and preachy. I think that's the wrong way to go. I think these movies are ultimately about the survival of humans and how they overcome an amazing obstacle. Ooh, the one with James Franco cutting his arm off. What was it, 125 hours? I forget the name. 128 hours? Like, that's kind of a disaster movie in its own way. I can't even watch that movie. See, that's why you got to be careful with these movies. Like, I literally will not go see that James Franco movie. There's no way I want to watch a movie about a guy cutting off his own arm. I mean, screw that. I don't want to see it. There's certain disaster movies take place out in the ocean. There's one about scuba divers. They're on a scuba dive expedition, and the boat leaves them behind, leaves them stranded out in the ocean. I cannot see that movie. That to me, that's just too much. I wouldn't want to see that movie. I have seen a couple of movies that take place in the ocean. They're kind of disastery movies. Dead Calm is a good one with Billy Zane. And, you know, I've seen Jaws and stuff like that. But being stranded out in the middle of the ocean, no, I can't. So, I mean, you have to take that into account when you're crafting these movies. Everybody's got their trigger, boy. They ain't going to go see certain things no matter how well you present them. You know, if somebody had a relative that died in an earthquake, or, you know, died whatever, I mean, that's probably a lot of the reason why you haven't seen a movie, or really a lot of movies based on 9/11 or a 9/11 like movie, because at least on the East Coast, so many people had a connection to September 11th who were still around. I did. I had he was a very distant cousin, and he was in one of the towers, and, you know, he died. I didn't really know him, but you know, it's when you have so many people connected to a disaster, you know, a lot of them just would hear about a movie like that and go, no, I'm not going to go see that. So, something to consider when you're writing a disaster movie. But again, follow the 3-act structure, do your research, and should you write a disaster movie, it's a very tight window. I would say if you know, if a big disaster happens and they haven't done a movie about it, and it's not too close to home, it's got to be in the news, but it can't be too close to home like September 11th. So, you know, if suddenly a lot of tidal waves hit again, you know, maybe you could do a tidal wave movie. It kind of is about what's in vogue and what's, you know, on the minds of people enough so they'll do it. It tends to be a big budget movie too, so it's probably not going to be a movie that you're going to get to write. You know, unless you're connected to the studio, in which case you're not watching this video. So, Overall, I guess I would say maybe if you can come up with a low budget version of a disaster movie, maybe. Or if you're doing a comedy, or maybe if you're doing a zombie movie, I'm definitely going to have to do a video about zombie movies. On that note, my name is Tony D. You can check me out at Patreon. I still haven't gotten on Subscribestar. Soon I will. Also, check me out on the Webcomic Factory and Superfrat, where you see my webcomics. I will see you next time.